Do you, do you think that designer jacket gives you any privileges here, old woman? Officer Rhett Callahan's voice was rough, dripping with pure contempt, in the moments before the sharp click of his steel handcuffs shattered the quiet of the parking lot. Clack. The cold metal tightened around her wrists, silencing even the cheerful birdsong under the warm sun. Judge Amara Quill did not flinch, though the grocery bag slipped from her hand, and the oranges scattered across the scorching asphalt like bright orange tears. "I told you I did not need your help," she said, in a voice that remained unnervingly calm, despite the humiliation. And now he had committed a mistake from which there would be no turning back. Callahan sneered and shook his head, while stunned shoppers stood frozen around them. "The only mistake," he growled, "is that people like you think they have any say in my city." What he did not know was that the 58-year-old woman he had just handcuffed was a powerful federal judge, someone who could overturn laws with a single signature and who had a direct line to the Department of Justice. So what happens when an abuser with a badge arrests the law itself? Where do you stand? Give this a like and subscribe to see how justice is served. The afternoon sun was a gentle warmth across the wide parking lot of the Oak Creek Grand Market, a luxury supermarket where the city's wealthy came for organic kale and imported cheese. The air smelled of hot asphalt and the soft, sweet perfume of the flowering crepe myrtles lining the medians. For Judge Amara Quill, it was a rare moment of ordinary peace. At 58, she had spent 3 decades navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the American legal system, a life marked by precedents and appeals. Today, however, her only goal was to decide between salmon or sea bass for dinner. She moved with a measured grace that spoke of quiet authority, her shopping cart gliding silently before her. She wore no sober black robe of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, only elegant civilian clothes, a deep twilight purple silk blouse that shimmered in the sunlight, perfectly tailored cream linen trousers, and simple but expensive leather flats. A string of pearls, a gift from her late husband, rested against her throat. She looked like a woman who inspired respect because she had earned it, not because she demanded it. Her cart was nearly full: fresh produce, a bottle of Chardonnay, a small bouquet of white lilies. As she pushed it toward her modest yet immaculate black sedan, she savored the anonymity. Here she was not Judge Quill, the formidable legal mind whose opinions were studied in law schools. She was simply Amara, a widow doing her shopping. It felt like shedding a heavy skin, a brief respite from the weight of a lifetime appointment. The tranquility was broken by the guttural roar of an engine. Amara's senses, sharpened by years of reading hostile courtrooms, sharpened at once. A police cruiser. Unit 7. Charlie swung into the parking lane beside her, braking so abruptly that the vehicle rocked on its suspension. It was an aggressive, unnecessary maneuver in a half-empty lot. This was not a patrol. This was circling. Amara stopped, one hand resting on her cart, and watched the vehicle with an analytical gaze. The driver's door flew open. Officer Rhett Callahan stepped out. He was 34, thick-necked, the collar of his uniform straining, his forced arrogance often masking a deep insecurity. Mirror sunglasses hid his eyes, but not his contempt. His partner, Officer Finley Shaw, a rookie barely out of his teens, climbed from the passenger seat, looking nervous and out of place among the luxury sedans and SUVs. Callahan did not approach her directly. He circled her vehicle, boots crunching on the asphalt, running a gloved hand along the fender as if searching for a flaw. He stopped at the rear tire and gave it a kick. "Is this your vehicle, ma'am?" he asked. He did not look at her face. He looked at the silk blouse, the pearls, making a quick appraisal. A woman of color in an elegant car in a wealthy neighborhood. The equation in his head was simple and ugly. Something about this picture was wrong. "Yes, it is," Amara answered in a serene, steady voice. The same voice that had silenced belligerent attorneys and delivered historic rulings. A voice that carried the subsonic frequency of absolute command. "We have a report," Callahan said, walking toward her, deliberately invading her personal space. He came too close, a classic intimidation tactic. "A report of a woman matching your description trying to break into vehicles in this parking lot." Amara raised one eyebrow almost imperceptibly. It was a lie, and a poorly constructed one. A report from whom, and at what time was this supposed report made? She tightened her jaw. He was not used to being questioned. He was used to fear and immediate obedience. "That's police business. I need to see your driver's license and the vehicle registration." "I am on private property, officer, and I am not operating the vehicle," Amara declared, her tone shifting from conversational to instructive. "You have no legal grounds to demand my identification under these circumstances. You have not seen me commit any crime, and your report is far too vague to constitute reasonable suspicion. In fact, it is an obvious pretext." The atmosphere shifted. Casual shoppers nearby began to slow. Their curiosity grew. A man loading his truck a few rows away pulled out his phone. The screen glowed. "You a lawyer or something?" Callahan asked with disdain, twisting the corner of his mouth. "Giving me a sermon." He rested his hand on his belt, fingers drumming near the grip of his pistol. "I don't care what you think the law is. I'm telling you what's going to happen. You're going to show me your identification, or I'm arresting you for obstruction." "That would be an unlawful arrest," Amara said, with unbroken patience, yet absolute control. "And I advise you to reconsider your next words very carefully." "I don't need your advice," Callahan snapped. He turned to his partner. "Keep an eye on her, Shaw. She's probably got a wallet full of stolen credit cards." Then he looked back at Amara. "You think that fancy blouse gives you respect, old woman?" It was the final escalation. This was no longer simply an officer making a mistake. This was an abuser hunting a target. Amara recognized the pattern. She had seen it in countless police reports and courtroom testimonies. It was the predictable, tragic trajectory of unchecked power colliding with baseless prejudice. She made a decision, not to fight, but to document, to allow the rot to come into the light. "I am a citizen on my own property trying to load my groceries," she said clearly, for the benefit of the growing audience and their recording phones, "and you are harassing me without cause." "That's it," Callahan growled. "You're done." He reached for his handcuffs. "Hands behind your back. You're under arrest." The air in the parking lot thickened with an almost visible attention, a haze of disbelief and confrontation. Shoppers who moments earlier had been focused on their weekend errands now formed a silent, motionless audience before a drama unfolding in real time. The soft click of phone cameras recording was the only sound that challenged the authority in Officer Callahan's voice. Judge Amara Quill did not move. She neither resisted nor obeyed. She simply stood with a posture as upright and unyielding as the marble columns of her own courtroom. Her gaze locked on Callahan's. Her calm was not passive. It was an active, tactical choice. She was giving him every opportunity to step back from the precipice he so desperately wanted to leap from. Every second that passed was another inch of rope she was handing him. "Officer," she said in a voice that sliced through the tension with surgical precision, "I am going to ask you again. On what specific grounds are you arresting me?" The legal terminology, spoken with such authority and natural ease, was like a spark to dry tinder for Callahan's temper. He saw it as a challenge, a mockery of his power. His face, already flushed with aggression, darkened to a mottled crimson. "The grounds are whatever I say they are," he shouted, his voice cracking with rage. He took another step forward. His body language was a physical manifestation of his verbal aggression. I gave you a lawful order to identify yourself, and you refused. That's obstruction of justice. That's failure to comply. Now turn around and put your hands behind your back before I put you on the ground. Your order was not lawful, Amara corrected him again, her voice still desperately serene. An order must be based on a legal foundation. You have provided none. Therefore, my refusal to obey an unlawful order does not constitute obstruction. She was not arguing. She was lecturing. She was turning the parking lot into her classroom, and Officer Callahan was the failing student. The humiliation was more than he could bear. Beside him, the rookie, Officer Shaw, shifted his weight from foot to foot. His face was pale, his eyes wide, flicking from his furious partner to the woman of impossible composure. In his stomach, he felt the deep, cold certainty that something was terribly wrong. The academy training, the lectures on de-escalation and constitutional policing, echoed faintly but persistently in his mind. This was not what it was supposed to look like. Rhett, Shaw murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Maybe we should just run the plates. Check the VIN. We can shut up, Shaw, Callahan snapped, without even bothering to look at his partner. All his attention was a laser beam of fury aimed at Amara. Never question me in the field. You learn the job by watching, and right now you're watching how we deal with this kind of attitude. He turned his venom back on Amara. What attitude? He repeated with scorn. You come into our neighborhood driving your luxury car, wearing your expensive clothes, and you think the rules don't apply to you. You think you can talk down to us? The law applies to everyone, Amara said quietly, especially to those who have sworn to uphold it. That simple, final truth was the breaking point. It was the perfect synthesis of everything he was not, of everything he betrayed. With a guttural growl, Callahan lunged at her. He did not wait for her to turn. He seized her left arm, fingers digging into the delicate silk of her blouse, and yanked it behind her back with a violent jerk. Amara gasped, the breath driven sharply from her lungs as a spike of pain shot through her shoulder. The fabric of her blouse, a work of art she had treasured for years, tore with a sickening sound. The pearls around her neck swung violently. Her shopping cart, shoved by the force of the assault, rolled backward and tipped over. The carefully chosen contents spilled across the asphalt. The bottle of Chardonnay, the white flowers, the bag of oranges. The wine bottle did not break, but the bag split open, and a dozen perfect gleaming spheres of fruit scattered across the dirty ground, rolling under her car, and the cruiser-like witnesses fleeing a crime scene. The place was at once mundane and terrifying. The simple, everyday act of grocery shopping had been violently interrupted. The scattered oranges were a vibrant, shocking splash of color against the grim black and white of the arrest unfolding. Callahan did not seem to notice or care. He was a machine of fury, his movements sharp and brutal. He snapped one cuff onto her right wrist, and the cold steel bit into her skin. He struggled to secure the other arm. The angle was awkward and painful. "Stop resisting!" he shouted, even though she was doing nothing of the sort. She was simply standing, allowing her body to be manhandled. Her mind was a fortress of cold, clear calculation. She absorbed every detail, the pain in her shoulder, the sensation of silk tearing, the gasps of the onlookers, the terrified look on Shaw's face. Everything was evidence, everything would be remembered. "I am not resisting," she stated, her voice tight with the pain of the contorted arm, but still clear. "You are using excessive force." "You want to see excessive?" Callahan growled into her ear, his breath hot and smelling of stale coffee. He finally managed to lock the second cuff, yanking it down until it was brutally tight. cutting off circulation to her hands. The click of the steel locking into place was a sound of absolute irrevocability. A Rubicon had been crossed. A line had been drawn. And Officer Rhett Callahan had just placed himself and his entire department on the wrong side of it. The metallic click of the handcuffs closing echoed with chilling finality through the sunny parking lot. It was a sound that transformed a citizen into a prisoner, a confrontation into a formal arrest. Officer Rhett Callahan breathed heavily as his adrenaline-fueled rage gave way to a presumptuous sense of victory. He tightened his grip on Amara's arm. The ruined silk of her blouse crumpled in his fist. He shoved her forward, a sharp, unnecessary gesture of dominance. "Let's walk." Amara stumbled, but recovered her balance with the innate grace that had never left her. The pain in her shoulder was a sharp, throbbing fire, and her wrists already ached from the crushing pressure of the cuffs, yet her face remained impassive. She looked at the oranges scattered across the ground, a vibrant testament to the ruined peace of the afternoon. Then she lifted her head and began walking toward the cruiser with measured, deliberate steps. They would not force her to shuffle like a frog. They would not drag her. She would walk to her cage as if she were walking to the bench. The crowd of onlookers had grown. What had been a few curious glances was now a semicircle of two dozen people whose faces mixed horror, indignation, and fear. Their phones were held high like digital torches, recording every moment of the degradation. They were silent, but their cameras screamed. Callahan was aware of them. In fact, he seemed to be performing for them. His voice was louder than necessary, his movements more theatrical. "This is what happens when you don't respect the law in this city," he announced to the crowd, yanking Amara's arm for emphasis. "You mean your law, officer?" a man in the crowd shouted, his voice thick with disgust. Callahan snapped his head toward the voice. "You got something to say?" he challenged. But he did not press it. He refocused on his captive. He was the star of the show, and she was his supporting act. Officer Shaw, the rookie, hurried to open the rear door of the cruiser. His hands were shaking. He avoided looking Amara in the face, focusing instead on the torn fabric of her blouse and the red marks already forming on her wrists. He had been on the force for 6 months, and this was the first time he had felt true shame for the uniform he wore. "Get in!" Callahan shouted, shoving Amara toward the open door. The back of a police car is not designed for comfort or dignity. It is a narrow cage of hard molded plastic that smells of stale sweat and disinfectant. Amara had to twist her body at an awkward angle to get her handcuffed hands and her tall frame through the opening. Callahan did not help her. He pushed the back of her head, forcing her down. Her knee struck the hard plastic seat, and another spike of pain shot through her leg. The door slammed shut, and the sound locked her into the stifling heat of the interior. The tinted windows distorted the outside world, turning the concerned faces of the spectators into wavering, indistinct blots. She was in a fishbowl, a piece of Callahan's traveling circus of authority. Callahan leaned against the car, enjoying the attention, while Shaw began the perfunctory task of gathering the spilled groceries. The rookie handled the items with a strange reverence, as if they were evidence of a far more serious crime. He picked up the oranges one by one with slow, clumsy movements. He looked at the bottle of Chardonnay, then at Amara's car with its still open trunk. He looked lost, like a child dressed up in a violent game of grown men. Inside the car, Amara closed her eyes for a moment, shutting out the distorted view. She centered herself, rising above the pain and the humiliation. Her mind, her greatest weapon, began to work. She was no longer a shopper. She was no longer a victim. She was a jurist analyzing a case, her own. She cataloged the violations. 1. lack of reasonable suspicion for the initial stop. 2. An unlawful demand for identification. 3. A false pretext for the arrest. Obstruction. 4. Excessive force during the arrest. 5. Public degradation. 6. Failure to read her rights. Miranda. The list grew. Each point was a nail in the coffin Callahan was building for himself. She shifted, searching for a less painful position for her handcuffed hands. Her fingers were already beginning to go numb, a dangerous sign. Callahan finally climbed into the driver's seat. As the car settled under his weight, he adjusted his mirror sunglasses in the rear view, admiring his own reflection. "Buckle up, sweetheart," he said, revving the engine with a roar that was pure theater. "You're going for a little ride downtown." And he looked at her through the metal partition with a cruel smile. "Maybe a night in the drunk tank will teach you some manners. You can tell all your new friends in the cell about your fancy blouse." Amara did not answer. She simply stared at the back of his neck with a disconcerting stillness. She was no longer merely a judge. She was a prisoner of war, and her enemy, drunk on his own petty power, had just made a catastrophic tactical error. He had captured a Trojan horse and had no idea what, or who, waited inside. The cruiser pulled out of the parking lot with a squeal of tires, leaving behind a scene of confusion, scattered oranges, and the simmering anger of a dozen new witnesses. The interior of the patrol car was a world completely different from the open air of the Oak Creek market. The windows were sealed, trapping the stifling heat and the cheap air freshener that failed to mask years of human misery. Judge Amara Quill sat perfectly upright on the hard plastic seat. Her posture was impeccable, despite the cuffs digging into the nerves of her wrists. She did not slump. She did not rest her head against the window. She watched the thick neck of Officer Callahan with the focused, dispassionate intensity of a scholar studying a flawed legal argument. She observed every detail: his haircut slightly too long at the nape, a minor uniform violation; the way he drummed his fingers on the steering wheel in time with the rock music blaring from the radio; the way he constantly checked the rearview mirror, not for traffic, but to catch her gaze, searching for a reaction. Fear, rage, tears. She gave him none. Her face was a placid lake, betraying none of the furious, precise calculations taking place beneath the surface. "You see her face?" Callahan asked Shaw in a boastful shout over the music. He slapped the dashboard. "Just like all the rest of them. They think their money makes them bulletproof." She went quiet the second the cuffs went on, didn't she? Officer Shaw in the passenger seat shifted uncomfortably. He glanced at Amara through the metal mesh. Shaw was young, perhaps 22, with a face that had not yet hardened into the cynical mask of a veteran cop. He had joined the force with a vague, idealistic notion of helping people. This did not feel like helping. "She didn't fight back, Rhett," Shaw said quietly, his voice almost lost in the noise. "You tore her shirt. Continuous use of force. I'm not sure this qualifies." "She was resisting verbally," Callahan snapped, his good mood vanishing at the first hint of disagreement. "Verbal non-compliance is resistance, kid. You have to establish your dominance from the start. If you let them talk, you lose control. That's day one stuff." Amara listened, her mind a silent recorder. Establish your dominance. The phrase was a window into his entire worldview. For him, policing was not about protection or service. It was about power and submission. "Officer Shaw," Amara said. Her calm, resonant voice cut through the interior of the car like a cello in a garage band. The rookie jumped, startled, and turned his head with wide eyes. "Ma'am, prisoners don't talk," Callahan barked, staring hard into the rearview mirror. Amara ignored him completely, focusing entirely on the weaker of the two. Officer Shaw, for the record of your next report, it is now past 2. I have not been read my rights, Miranda. I also inform you that I sustained a physical injury to my left shoulder as a result of the arresting officer's actions. Your complicit silence makes you an accomplice to these violations. Accomplice? Callahan laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. Listen to her. She thinks she's on a television show. You're not in a courtroom, lady. You're in my car. And in my car, my rules are the only ones that matter. He slammed on the brakes at a red light. The sudden deceleration threw Amara forward. Without hands to brace herself, she struck the hard mesh divider with her good shoulder. Pain shot through her entire body, but she only emitted a sharp grunt as she controlled her breathing. She immediately righted herself, tensing the muscles of her torso to regain her posture. "Oops," Callahan exclaimed with disdain, watching her in the mirror. He was hoping for a plea, a curse, any sign that he was breaking her. He got nothing but that same steady, unsettling gaze. Amara decided to press her advantage with the rookie. The legal principle is called the duty to intervene. It has been affirmed in federal courts across the country. It establishes that an officer who witnesses another officer using excessive force has a legal and ethical obligation to intervene. Your failure constitutes a separate and distinct civil rights violation. Do you know this principle? Shaw swallowed hard. He looked at Amara, then at the back of Callahan's neck. He knew she was right. They had spent a week on it at the academy. It was Title 42, Section 1983 of the United States Code. "She's trying to get inside your head, kid," Callahan growled as the car started moving again. "She's a professional manipulator. That's how people of her class get away with everything. With words. Not today." The racial animus, previously a background note, was now explicit. Amara had cross-examined Klansmen on the stand, who possessed greater subtlety. The cruiser left the manicured streets of Oak Creek and headed downtown. The landscape changed from luxury boutiques to pawn shops and bail bond offices. The 4th Precinct sat in the desolate, abandoned heart of the city. Amara looked out the window and saw the American flag flying above the county courthouse, its colors bright against the blue sky. She had dedicated her life to defending the ideals that flag represented, and now she was the captive of a man who used the authority those ideals granted him as a weapon against them. She flexed her fingers behind her back. The numbness was turning into a painful pins and needles sensation. She needed to maintain dexterity. She began a controlled breathing exercise, a technique she had learned to manage stress during long, contentious trials. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4. Her heart rate, which had spiked with the initial attack, began to slow. "She's doing something weird back there," Shaw said, watching her in the rear view. "She's just breathing. She's not scared, Rhett. Most people are crying or screaming by now. She's high." Callahan dismissed it, inventing a new fiction. "Or crazy. We'll get a psych evaluation. Add resisting arrest with violence. We'll say she tried to bite you, Finley. It'll be my word and yours against hers. Guess who the prosecutor believes?" The lie was so blatant, so bold, that Shaw shuddered. They were recruiting him into a conspiracy right there in the front seat. "Officer Callahan," Amara spoke again in a voice of ice. "Badge number 4812. Do you have children?" The question was so unexpected it startled him. "What? That's none of your business." "I am offering you one last chance," Amara continued, relentless and precise. "One last exit before the bridge collapses. Turn around. Take me back to my car. Remove these handcuffs. If you do this now, I will ensure that you are only suspended and retrained, not fired and imprisoned. You will keep your pension. You will be able to support your family." Callahan jerked the car to the side of the road with a screech of tires. He twisted in his seat, his face a mask of purple rage, a vein throbbing in his temple. "You listen to me," he said, pointing a trembling finger through the mesh. "I am the law here. My father was a captain on this force. My union rep is my uncle. You are nothing. You are a stain on my Saturday. I am going to process you. I am going to put you in a cell with the junkies. And on Monday, a judge is going to laugh at you. That's how this works. That's how it always works." "Not today," Amara said in a voice that was both broken and a promise. "Take us to the station," Callahan ordered Shaw, his voice trembling with fury. "Now." As the car merged back into traffic, Amara looked at her wrist. The cuff had left the skin raw, but on that same wrist, she wore her watch, a simple, elegant timepiece. It had a small, discreet side button, a feature she had specially installed. It was not a traditional beacon. It was a silent data relay. She had not pressed it yet. She needed to see the interior. She needed to know the desk sergeant. She needed to know Callahan's lieutenant. She needed every link in the chain of corruption to reveal itself before she decided to act. The booking room of the 4th Precinct was an assault on the senses, a place where institutional despair had a physical smell. It was an acrid cocktail of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and the faint sour odor of unclean humanity. The fluorescent ceiling lights buzzed with an intermittent, incessant hum, casting a sickly greenish-white light that made everyone look ill. It was a room designed to strip people of their identity, to process them into paperwork. Officer Callahan shoved Amara toward the high, worn counter, with theatrical brusqueness meant to impress the desk sergeant. The sergeant, a man in his 50s named Donovan Pike, had the build of a retired offensive lineman. He looked up from his crossword and ran his eyes over Amara with practiced deep boredom. He had seen thousands like her, or so he believed. "What is this, Callahan? Did you miss the memo? We're not arresting the Garden Club ladies anymore," he said, around a cheap cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth. "This one had an attitude," Callahan announced, grabbing Amara by the shoulder and spinning her toward the counter. "We got a report she was breaking into cars at the Grand Market. She refused to identify herself and resisted." Pike let out a dry, sharp chuckle. He examined Amara slowly and thoroughly, noting the torn purple silk, the pearls, the raw skin on her wrists, and the unbreakable dignity in her gaze. "Breaking into cars in a blouse that costs more than my mortgage. Yeah, right. Most likely her husband cut up her credit cards." Amara remained silent, her back straight, as if she were being presented before the Supreme Court. Callahan removed the cuffs from one hand, only long enough to slam it down on the dirty counter for fingerprints. "Name," Pike grunted, his sausage-like fingers hovering over a keyboard sticky with years of grime. "Quill," she said in a clear, firm voice that stood in stark contrast to the ambient misery of the room. "Amara, middle initial M, as in money," Pike smirked. "Address? 7 Willow Creek Lane, Oak Creek." Pike stopped typing. He looked at Callahan. They exchanged a glance of cynical amusement. It was one of the most exclusive addresses in the city. "I'm not putting down a fixed address," Pike said as he continued typing. "Subject refused to cooperate regarding residence." "You are deliberately falsifying an official police record, Sergeant," Amara said, in a familiar yet firm tone. "That is a felony under both state and federal law. I suggest you write exactly what I told you." Callahan seized the back of Amara's neck. His hand was a fleshy vice. "Shut your mouth. You don't get to quote the law in here. You lost that privilege when you decided to be a criminal. Now look at the camera for the mugshot." They pushed Amara in front of a height chart painted on a dirty wall. She stood tall, chin high. She looked directly into the lens, not with anger or fear, but with an expression of profound disappointment, as if the camera itself had failed to live up to its potential. The flash fired, a blinding burst. "Profile," Callahan ordered. She turned. The profile shot captured the slight swelling of her cheek, where she had struck the partition, and the raw, stinging abrasion on her wrist. Evidence dated, timed, and permanent. "Prints," Callahan said, boredom returning now that the initial excitement of the arrest had faded. They led Amara to the fingerprint scanner. She pressed her fingers one by one onto the cold glass plate. The green light of the scanner swept across her skin. The machine beeped. On Pike's monitor, a red banner appeared instantly at the top of the screen. "Access denied. File sealed by federal court order." "What the hell is this?" Pike muttered, squinting at the screen. He hit the refresh key, but the banner remained. "System's failing again. Says file sealed. Some kind of federal flag. Probably a witness protection case that got marked by mistake." Callahan leaned over the counter, annoyed. "Just override it. We're not waiting. Put her in as Jane Doe if you have to. I want her in a cell so I can finish my shift." "It's not a mistake," Amara said quietly, almost to herself. "It's a warning. I told you to shut up." Callahan spun around, his face contorted with anger. He was beginning to realize that his usual intimidation tactics were having no effect, and that was making him nervous. "Strip search." The booking room fell silent. Even the drunk passed out on a nearby bench seemed to stir. Officer Shaw, who had been hovering by the door like a lost child, stepped forward hesitantly. "Rhett, a strip search?" Shaw asked in a weak voice. "For a misdemeanor obstruction? Protocol says that only applies to serious narcotics or weapons felonies. We don't have probable cause for that." "I have probable cause," Callahan lied smoothly, his eyes cold and empty. "I think she's concealing contraband. I felt something tucked into her waistband when I patted her down. Could be a weapon. Could be drugs. We have to ensure facility safety. Shaw, you want to be the guy who let a weapon into the cell block?" Amara understood the tactic instantly. It had nothing to do with safety. It was about humiliation. It was the ultimate degradation tool designed to break a person's spirit. It was a tactic she had read about, ruled on, and condemned from the bench. "I do not consent to a body search," Amara declared for the record. "You have no probable cause. This is a serious violation of my Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable searches and seizures." "I am the probable cause," Callahan sneered. "Bring her to the room." He pointed to a small, windowless room off to the side. Amara looked at Callahan. She looked at Pike, who was now watching with a lazy smile. She looked at Shaw, who appeared ready to vomit. Violence would only validate their narrative. She had to endure the process. She had to let them build their own gallows piece by piece. She walked into the cold, sterile room. A female officer she had not seen before, her face a mask of indifference, waited for her. "Take off your clothes," the officer said in a monotone voice. Amara began to undress. She removed the ruined silk blouse, folding it carefully despite the tear. She removed her trousers and shoes. Standing there in her undergarments, she revealed a long, jagged scar that ran down her left side from ribs to hip. The officer paused. "What's that from?" she asked, a flash of curiosity replacing her bored tone. "A car accident," Amara lied quietly. The truth was far more complex. It was from desperate surgery to save her life after an attack in the courtroom years earlier by a defendant. But the scar now served a purpose. It was a map of survival. "Fine," the officer said, with a slight hesitation in her bravado. She performed the search with movements that were now tentative. "She's clean." Back at the booking counter, Amara dressed slowly. Her precise movement stood in sharp contrast to the chaos and indignity of the situation. She buttoned the torn blouse, a signal of her violated dignity. "Phone call," she said as she tucked it in. "I have a right to a phone call." Pike pointed with his thumb toward a battered public phone on the wall, its coiled cord greasy and tangled. "Make it. Better call a bondsman. The judge I know sets high bail for people who hate cops." Amara approached the phone and lifted the heavy receiver. It smelled of stale breath and desperation. She did not call a local attorney. She did not call a family member. She dialed a long-distance number with the area code 202, a number that appeared in no directory, a number that routed through a secure switchboard at the Department of Justice in Washington. It rang once. A crisp, professional voice answered. U.S. Marshal Service Command. Authorization Nightingale, Amara said. Her voice had changed. The weary but defiant tone was gone, replaced by the sharp, efficient cadence of command. Confirming user Quill, Amara M. There was half a second of silence on the line, the faint sound of rapid typing. Then the voice on the other end shifted from professional to one of extreme urgency. Voice print and authorization confirmed. Good afternoon, Judge Quill. This is an unscheduled transmission. Please state your status. Code Violet, Amara said. The words floated in the stale air of the precinct, invisible but powerful. Unlawful detention by a local entity. Location 4th Precinct, City of Greenfield. Officer Callahan, badge 4812. I am currently in custody and unarmed. Code Violet confirmed. Your Honor, are you in immediate physical danger? The immediate physical threat has passed. The constitutional threat continues, Amara answered. Activate Protocol Guardian. I want a complete intercept of communications in this facility and deploy the Special Operations Group under standard rules of engagement. SOG team is launching from the regional airfield. Estimated time of arrival 19 minutes. We are tracking your location through your security data. Last ping. Stand by, Your Honor. The cavalry is on the way. Amara hung up the phone and turned around. Callahan was watching her, an arrogant smile on his face. Who is that? He mocked. Your dealer? Your pimp? Tell him you'll be a little late tonight. Amara looked at Callahan. A small, cold smile touched her lips for the first time. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a grand master who has just placed her opponent in an inevitable checkmate. I called the office, she said. Callahan laughed. What? They pay you at the welfare office. Don't worry, you'll get 3 meals a day where you're going. Something like that, Amara said quietly. Cell Block B, Cell 4, Callahan ordered. Pike, get bored again. Let her think about what she did. A night on a steel slab is the solution to most attitude problems. They escorted her to the cells. The heavy iron bars slammed shut with a deafening clang that echoed down the concrete corridor. Amara sat on the cold metal bench. She did not collapse. She folded her hands in her lap. She was no longer a prisoner in a cell. She was a forward observer, calling in a precision strike on her own position. And the pilot's name was Justice. The holding cell was a cage of concrete and steel, refrigerated to a temperature designed for discomfort. The air was thick with the ghosts of past miseries. Across the narrow corridor, a man in another cell was bellowing an off-key country song. Judge Amara Quill ignored him. She sat on the cold metal bench with her back straight, not touching the dirty wall behind her. She was conducting a mental inventory, consolidating the timeline of events, the specific constitutional violations, and the identities of those involved. Callahan, the aggressor. Pike, the accomplice. Shaw, the silent accomplice. Her mind was a courtroom. The prosecution was methodically presenting its case. The defense had only bravado and lies. The verdict was already decided. Only the sentencing remained. The heavy steel door at the end of the cell block opened with a creak that echoed down the concrete hall. Heavy, deliberate footsteps approached. Officer Callahan appeared in front of her cell with an expression of smug satisfaction. He held a styrofoam cup of coffee. He took a long, noisy sip, savoring it. You know, he said, leaning against the bars, I've been checking a few things while you were getting comfortable. That address you gave me, 7 Willow Creek Lane, is a $5 million property. It belongs to some high-powered lawyer who died a few years ago. Amara said nothing. She simply watched him, breathing slowly and deliberately. So that leaves 2 possibilities, Callahan continued, visibly pleased with his own investigative work. 1. You're the most successful thief in the world, taking a break from stealing to buy organic arugula. Or 2, you're the maid, and you decided to take the boss's car for a spin while she's out of town. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. I'm betting on the maid, driving without a license, auto theft. We'll add those to the list of charges. Amara finally spoke. Her voice was as cold and hard as the bench she sat on. If you enter that property without a warrant signed by a federal magistrate, you will trigger a security protocol that alerts the United States Marshals Service directly. By the time you figure out how to disable the alarm, you will be cataloged as a hostile domestic threat. Callahan laughed, a harsh bark. Something out of a movie, huh? This lady's been watching too many films. He unlocked her cell door with a loud metallic clang. Come on. The lieutenant wants to talk to you. Says he wants to meet the Queen of Sheba before we put her in a can. Amara stood and smoothed the front of her torn blouse, a small, defiant act of dignity. She walked out of the cell with serene, measured movements. Callahan looked annoyed that he had not been able to drag her. The interrogation room was a genre cliché, a small, windowless booth with beige cinder block walls, a single metal table bolted to the floor, and a large 2-way mirror on one wall. Callahan shoved her into a metal chair. He locked one of the handcuffs to a steel ring welded to the table, chaining her in place. There, Callahan said, sitting across from her. Now let's talk serious. He slid a pre-printed form across the table. It was filled with fine print. This is a waiver. You admit you disturbed the peace. You waive your right to sue the department. Pay a $500 fine, and we drop the other charges. You can be out of here in an hour. We all forget this ever happened. It was the standard strategy. Coerce a signature, bury the liability. If she signed, she validated the entire story and admitted guilt. I'll need a pen, Amara said. A triumphant smile spread across Callahan's face. He believed he had won. See, I knew you were smart. Nobody wants to spend the weekend in county jail over a little misunderstanding. He pulled a cheap plastic pen from his shirt pocket and clicked it. Amara took it with her free hand and held the paper firmly. Then, with a single bold, powerful stroke, she drew a large X that crossed the entire document from corner to corner, the force of the pen tearing the paper. She slid it back across the table. I reject your offer. Callahan stared at the defaced document. The smile evaporated, replaced by a surge of pure rage that started in his thick neck and climbed to his ears. He slammed a fist on the table. The pen jumped and rolled to the floor. You think you're clever? He shouted, leaning so far over the table that she could smell the coffee on his breath. You think you can play these games? I'm offering you a way out, you stupid old woman. I am not playing games, Amara answered without flinching, without retreating a single centimeter. I am documenting them. You have unlawfully detained a citizen. You have falsified an arrest report. You have denied medical attention for an injury you yourself caused. She nodded toward her shoulder. Every minute I remain in this building, your personal and professional liability increases exponentially. You do not have me in your hand, Officer Callahan. You have a time bomb in your hand, and you have no idea how to defuse it. Suddenly, the door of the interrogation room flew open. A new figure entered. He was about 50, with a soft paunch and the weary, arrogant look of a man who had been middle management for too long. His name tag read Lieutenant Garrett Sloan. He was the next link in the chain. What the hell is going on here, Callahan? Sloan asked in a voice raspy from years of smoking. The desk sergeant said you brought in royalty. He looked at Amara chained to the table and then saw the red flag still blinking on the booking printout in his hand. Access denied. File sealed by federal court order. Sloan looked from the paper to Amara. For the first time, a flicker of something other than arrogance appeared in his eyes. It was not fear. Not yet. It was confusion. The pieces did not fit. Maids and thieves did not have federally sealed files. "Who are you?" Sloan asked, his voice losing some of its bravado. Amara looked at the lieutenant. She looked at the two-way mirror, knowing others were probably behind it. The audience was assembled. It was time for the curtain to rise. "That," she said, her voice resonating with a force she had held in reserve until now, "is an excellent question, Lieutenant, and I assure you that you are not going to like the answer." Lieutenant Garrett Sloan stood in the doorway of the interrogation room with the printout and its blinking red warning in his hand. He looked at Amara Quill. He truly looked at her for the first time, not as a suspect brought in by one of his impulsive officers, but as an anomaly, a problem he could not immediately categorize or dismiss. The expensive torn blouse, the pearls, the impossible composure of a woman chained to a table, and the federally sealed file. None of it made sense. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Sloan said, entering the room and closing the door. He adopted the tone of a reasonable man dealing with a hysterical situation. "Who are you? We have you for obstruction and resisting arrest. All of this can be resolved easily if you cooperate." "Cooperation is a two-way street," Amara answered, her gaze steady. "Until now, your department has engaged in a one-way exercise of unlawful force and intimidation. Before I answer any further questions, I will exercise my right to a telephone call." Sloan scoffed, regaining his balance. It was a familiar request, a return to known territory. "Fine. Callahan, unchain her. Take her to the phone. One call. Make it quick, and make it a lawyer willing to post a substantial bond." Officer Callahan, looking relieved that his superior was taking charge, fumbled with the key to the handcuffs on the table. He unlocked it. Amara rubbed her wrist as if feeling a phantom pain. Callahan jerked her roughly to her feet and led her out of the interrogation room. Back in the main booking area, the public phone on the wall was a relic. Its plastic housing was covered in graffiti, and the receiver was greasy to the touch. Amara picked it up with mild distaste, but her concentration was absolute. She ignored Callahan, who was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and a smug smile returning to his face. She ignored Sergeant Pike, who watched her with open curiosity. She turned her back to them, creating a small, temporary bubble of privacy. She raised the receiver to her ear and dialed from memory the 10-digit number. It was a number she had memorized the day she took her oath in the federal court, a number that was her salvation, and, if necessary, her sword. The phone rang once on the other end, a clean digital tone, completely alien to the filthy precinct. A male voice answered, crisp and professional, with no trace of greeting. "Command!" Amara's posture seemed to change. Her voice when she spoke was stripped of all emotion, leaving only pure, unadulterated authority. "Nightingale authorizing Protocol Guardian. Repeat. Protocol Guardian is active." There was an instant of silence on the other end, the sound of a switch being thrown, a system activating. Then the voice returned, sharp and urgent. "Good evening. We confirm Protocol Guardian is active. We have located your position at Precinct 4 Greenfield. Special Operations Group is en route. Estimated time of arrival 12 minutes. Are you under immediate pressure?" "The pressure is constant, but my situation is stable," Amara answered with clipped, precise words. "Subjects are Lieutenant Sloan, Sergeant Pike, and Officer Callahan. Badge 4812. who performed the arrest. They are currently engaged in a conspiracy to fabricate charges and have attempted to obtain a waiver of rights through coercion. They have physical custody of me. Understood, Nightingale. We are establishing a complete intercept of communications at the facility. All incoming and outgoing calls will be monitored and recorded. All network traffic is being mirrored to our servers. Do you have any further instructions? Amara glanced over her shoulder. Callahan was whispering something to Pike, and both men laughed. They were confident. They were in control. They were fools. Yes, Amara said into the phone. I want a full asset and liability analysis of Sloan, Pike, and Callahan. I want to know about their mortgages, their car payments, any pending complaints, their commendations, and their connections to the local union. I want a complete picture of the corruption, and wake a federal judge for the Eastern District. I will need a search and seizure warrant for this entire building effective upon the arrival of my team. Consider it done, Your Honor, the voice on the phone said. The use of her title was the first open acknowledgement of her identity. The warrant will be waiting. SOG has authorization for dynamic entry if necessary. We are with you, Nightingale. Stand by. The line went dead. Amara slowly replaced the receiver in its cradle. The metallic click of the plastic echoed in the suddenly quiet room. She turned to face the officers. The brief, cold smile had returned to her lips. Well? Callahan asked, pushing off the wall. You call your mommy to come pick you up. I called a colleague, Amara said simply. A colleague. Pike let out a laugh. What are you? Head of the local library committee? Your colleague is going to write a very strongly worded letter. Something like that, Amara said. She walked calmly back toward the cell area. If you are finished with your procedural violations, I would like to sit down. It has been a rather long day. Her obedience, her sudden willingness to return to the cell, seemed to confuse them. They had expected a fight, tears, a desperate plea now that her one phone call had apparently failed. Her serene acceptance of her fate was more disconcerting than any resistance. Yeah, whatever, Callahan muttered, disoriented. Put her back in the cage. When the cell door slammed shut for the second time, Amara sat on the bench. She looked at her simple, elegant watch. She subtracted 12 minutes. The game was over. The pieces were in place. All that remained was for the other player to realize he had been in checkmate for the last half hour. Outside, beyond the filthy walls of the precinct, a storm was gathering. It was not a storm of rain and thunder, but of Kevlar, federal warrants, and an unstoppable fury. And it was 12 minutes away. Sergeant Lyra Kane was not in the booking room. She was hidden in a small, windowless office behind the main counter, a space crowded with stacks of unresolved files and carrying a faint smell of burnt coffee and paper dust. At 52, Lyra had spent 25 years with the Greenfield Police Department, 20 of them as a desk sergeant. She had watched rookies become chiefs, and the best cops become cynical, pot-bellied patrolmen. She had a sixth sense for trouble, an internal barometer perfectly tuned to detect the shifts in atmospheric pressure that preceded a departmental storm. And right now her barometer was about to explode. She had heard the commotion in the booking room. She knew Rhett Callahan's voice, loud, arrogant, and usually the prelude to a lawsuit. She had seen him drag the woman in the torn purple blouse. Something about the woman's posture, the defiant lift of her chin, even as she was being shoved, had caught Lyra's attention. This was not the typical Saturday afternoon drunk or shoplifter. This was different. Then she saw the printout that Pike had carelessly left on the communal printer. Access denied. File sealed by federal court order. Lyra had seen federal flags before. They were rare. Sometimes it was a protected witness. Sometimes it was an undercover agent. But they were always serious. For Pike and Callahan to dismiss it as a technical glitch was, at best, laziness, and at worst, criminal negligence. Her instincts, honed by decades of watching cops take shortcuts, told her it was the latter. "Don't get involved, Lyra," she muttered to herself, returning to her paperwork. "Not your circus, not your monkeys." But the image of the woman's face would not leave her. The eyes showed no fear. They were analytical, like a scientist observing a particularly fascinating and repulsive species of insect. Lyra shoved her chair back. Enough. She left her office and walked to Pike's empty desk. Lieutenant Sloan and Callahan had taken the woman into interrogation. Pike was in the break room. She sat in front of his terminal. The screen was still open to the booking file. Jane Doe, no fixed address, a falsified record. The charge itself was false. Lyra knew the woman had given an address because she had heard it. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Lieutenant Sloan had given an implicit order by endorsing the glitch theory. Leave it alone. Digging further was to question his authority, to go against the blue wall culture of the precinct. It was a risk. She could be demoted, transferred to the night shift in records for the rest of her career. To hell with that, she whispered. She did not have the administrative credentials to override the federal lock on the local system, but she did have access to the National Crime Information Center. The NCIC portal, an independent federal system, was a risky bet. Most sealed files were sealed there too, but sometimes a different portal produced a different result. She took a deep breath and typed the name she had heard. Quill, Amara. She pressed enter. The system took a moment. The hourglass icon spun. Lyra's heart began to beat a little faster. Then the screen went black. For one terrifying second, she thought she had crashed the entire system. When the monitor came back to life, the familiar blue NCIC interface was gone. It had been replaced by a stark black background. At the top, in blood-red capital letters, a banner flashed. Warning, eyes only. Level 7, Judicial Security File. Failed access attempt logged. Trace initiated. Lyra shoved back from the screen. Her chair scraped with a screech. A freezing terror washed over her. Level 7. She had not even known a Level 7 existed. Beneath the terrifying banner, the seal of the United States Department of Justice slowly rotated, and below it, a block of clear, unmistakable text. Subject: Quill, Amara M. Rank title: Circuit Judge. United States Court of Appeals, 9th Circuit. Status: active, lifetime appointment, security clearance, top secret / sensitive compartmented information. Note: subject is designated. A protected federal officer under Title 18, United States Code, Section 1114. Any unlawful detention or assault is a federal felony prosecutable by the Department of Justice. Oh my God, Lyra whispered, bringing her hand to her mouth, her face draining of color. A circuit judge. A federal judge. Not a traffic judge. Not a county judge. A judge of the 9th Circuit, one step below the Supreme Court. They were, for all practical purposes, legal royalty, and Rhett Callahan had just arrested one, torn her clothes, handcuffed her, and locked her in a cell. Lieutenant Sloan had her chained to a table in Interrogation Room 2. The cursor on the screen began to blink. A new text box appeared. Your terminal, Greenfield, P. Debooking 2 has been flagged. Do not log off. Awaiting instructions from United States Marshals Service. They knew. The moment she entered the name, a silent alarm had been triggered in some high-tech command center in Washington. They were no longer merely observing. They were inside the system. Lyra staggered back from the desk, her mind racing. She had to warn Sloan. He was arrogant, but he did not deserve to have his life destroyed by Callahan's testosterone-fueled stupidity. They had not merely arrested a woman. Without realizing it, they had declared war on the entire federal judiciary. She came out from behind the booking counter and ran down the short hallway toward the interrogation rooms. She nearly collided with Officer Shaw, who was standing guard outside, pale and nauseated. Shaw gasped as she grabbed his arm. "Where is she? Where is the judge?" Shaw's eyes widened in confusion. "The judge? What are you talking about, Sergeant?" "The woman, you idiot," Lyra hissed, shaking his arm. "The woman in the purple blouse is a federal judge." Shaw's face went completely white. He looked as if he might faint. "What? No, that can't be. I saw her file." "It's real. We have to get her out of there right now," Lyra said, turning toward the door. "Before the sky falls on us." She raised her hand to knock, to shout, to do something. But before her knuckles touched the wood, a sound began to fill the precinct. It started with a single discordant ring, then another, then another. The telephones. Every landline in the building began ringing simultaneously. A mad, deafening chorus of impending doom. And through the walls, she could hear the panicked shouts of officers in the bullpen as their cell phones, their computers, their entire digital world suddenly came alive with the same terrifying, unified alarm. The storm was no longer gathering. It had arrived. The cacophony was instantaneous and absolute. Dozens of telephones ringing in perfect, maddening synchrony created a wall of sound that rolled through the 4th precinct. It was not only the landlines. Officers in the main waiting area stared in panic and confusion at their personal cell phones, which were also ringing, displaying unknown or blocked caller information. Every desk terminal flickered. The department's standard screensaver dissolved into a black screen with a single blinking icon in the center, the seal of the United States Department of Justice. In Interrogation Room 2, Lieutenant Sloan and Officer Callahan froze. The discordant ringing of the single wall phone in the room was deafening in the confined space. Sloan stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. "What the hell is that?" Callahan babbled, finally losing the last remnants of his bravado. Sloan slowly picked up the phone with a trembling hand. "4th Precinct, Lieutenant Sloan." No human voice answered on the other end, only a perfectly calm, emotionless, synthesized female voice. It was the voice of a machine, and it was terrifying. "This is Protocol Guardian. Your facility's communication systems are now under the control of the United States Marshal Service. You are holding a protected federal officer. Release her immediately. Failure to comply will result in dynamic coercive action. You have 60 seconds. Click. The line went dead. Sloan slammed the receiver down, his face filled with disbelief and horror. "What did she do? Who did she call?" "It's not a game, Lieutenant." Sergeant Lyra Kane's voice came from the hallway as she flung the door open. Her face was pale. "I ran her name. She is who she says she is. She is Judge Amara Quill of the 9th Circuit. The system locked me out and sent a trace alert. They know everything." The final piece of the puzzle locked into place in Sloan's mind. The sealed file. The impossible composure. The phone call. He had walked blindly into a federal buzzsaw. His career, his pension, his freedom. Everything flashed before his eyes. A sharp, freezing panic seized his throat. "Fix it," he whispered, his voice cracking. "We have to fix this." He looked at Callahan with pure hatred. "This is your fault, you damn cowboy." "My fault?" Callahan shouted, his own panic transforming into rage. "You're the one who told me to book her!" "Uncuff her!" Sloan screamed, lunging toward Amara, who remained chained to the table, watching the collapse of her captors with the disinterested interest of a sociologist. "Get those handcuffs off her right now. We can say it was a misunderstanding, a case of mistaken identity." Callahan fumbled for the key to the handcuffs. His hands were shaking so badly that he dropped it. He dropped to his knees, searching the floor. "It is far too late for that, Lieutenant," Amara said, her voice cutting through the panic. "The moment you put your hands on me, this ceased to be a misunderstanding. It became a crime. The moment you falsified the report, it became a conspiracy. And right now, as we speak, every word you say is being recorded by federal authorities." Sloan froze with his hand suspended over Amara's cuffed wrist. He looked at the ceiling, at the walls, as if he could see the microphones. The precinct was no longer his fortress. It was a cage, and he was trapped inside it with a predator he had mistaken for prey. "The video," he said in a hoarse voice, looking at Callahan. "The body camera, the dash camera. Erase it. Erase everything right now." "The phones won't stop ringing, Lieutenant. The computers are locked," Callahan lamented from the floor, still unable to find his key. In the main bullpen, the scene was one of total institutional collapse. Officers were standing on their chairs, staring out the windows. "Holy Mother of God!" one of them shouted. "You have to see this!" Sergeant Kane ran from the interrogation room to the front entrance of the precinct. She looked through the large windows facing the street. Her heart stopped. The street was blocked. At both ends of the block, massive armored Bearcat vehicles were parked diagonally, blocking traffic. The sun reflected off the words stenciled on their sides. U.S. Marshals, Special Operations Group. In front of the precinct, 3 unmarked black Chevrolet Suburbans skidded to a halt in a perfect V formation, tires smoking. The doors flew open simultaneously. Men poured out, moving with a terrifying fluidity and efficiency. They were not police. They wore heavy tactical gear, black body armor, ballistic helmets with visors, and carried short-barreled carbines ready to fire. Their movements were precise, controlled, and absolutely threatening. On their arms, they wore the badges of the FBI and the Marshals Service. "They're here," Lyra whispered in awe and terror. Back in the interrogation room, Sloan had finally found a spare key on his belt and was frantically trying to unlock Amara's handcuffs. "Please, Judge," he begged in a pathetic whine. "It was Callahan. He's a hothead. I didn't know. I can have him fired. I can do whatever you want." The lock clicked open. Amara slowly rested her hand on the table, rubbing the raw, bruised wrist. She looked at the terrified lieutenant. "What I want, Lieutenant Sloan," she said in a dangerously low voice, "is for you to stand against that wall and remain silent. Your opportunity to fix this ended an hour ago." At that exact moment, a thunderous boom rolled through the building. Boom! It was the sound of the main doors of the precinct being blown off their hinges by an explosive charge. It was followed by the crash of glass and the shouts of federal agents. "Federal agents! Search warrant! Everybody on the ground! Hands where I can see them!" Sloan and Callahan stared at the open doorway of the interrogation room, their faces contorted with terror. They could hear the shouts of their startled, frightened colleagues, the clatter of weapons hitting the floor, the heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots on linoleum, the sound of the end of their world. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the chaos of the bullpen. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in full tactical gear, carbine held ready. He was the commander. His gaze swept the room, dismissing Sloan and Callahan as if they were furniture, and locked on Amara. He brought one hand to his helmet in a modified military salute. "Judge Quill," the federal marshal said in a calm, respectful voice amid the chaos. "Deputy Marshal Cale Voss, my team has secured the building. Are you unharmed?" Amara rose from the table, reclaiming her full stature and dignity. She smoothed the front of her torn purple blouse. "I am unharmed, Marshal," she answered. "But the Constitution has been grievously wounded today. Let us begin the surgery. The lobby of the 4th Precinct, moments earlier, a center of routine police activity, had been transformed into a military base. The tempered glass of the main doors formed a glittering diamond carpet on the floor. Dust and smoke from the detonating charge hung in the air, catching the afternoon sunlight in diffuse columns. Greenfield Police Department officers were on their knees with their hands laced behind their heads, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, fear, and absolute humiliation. The hunters had become the prey. U.S. Marshals and FBI agents moved through the space with the cold, expert efficiency of a surgical team. They cleared rooms, secured weapons, and herded the stunned local officers into a central area. There were no shouts, no wasted movements. It was a masterclass in tactical superiority. Deputy Marshal Cale Voss led Judge Quill out of the interrogation room. He walked slightly ahead of her like a human shield, his carbine pointed at the floor, but ready to fire in an instant. As they stepped into the waiting area, the scene of surrender fell silent. Every federal agent, every kneeling police officer turned to look. They saw the woman from the booking report, the stranger in the expensive torn blouse, but she was no longer a prisoner. She walked with an aura of absolute authority, flanked by the commander of the federal force. It was a paradigm shift so profound that the local officers could only watch, struggling to process the impossible reality. Lieutenant Sloan and Officer Callahan were dragged out behind her, each firmly held by a burly marshal. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the shuffling gait of defeated men. Callahan's mirror sunglasses were gone, revealing eyes wide with terror. Sloane's face was the color of ash. "This is an invasion!" Sloane suddenly shouted, finding a last spark of defiance. "You have no jurisdiction here. This is a municipal police station. I demand a warrant." Marshal Voss stopped. He turned his head slowly to look at Sloane with an expression of pure pity. "Lieutenant," he said in a dangerously quiet voice, "an act of war is kidnapping a federal judge. And as for the warrant," he nodded to another agent who stepped forward and pressed a thick document against Sloane's chest. "This warrant, signed by a federal magistrate 10 minutes ago, gives us authority over this entire building, every computer, every file, and every officer. You no longer have jurisdiction over the coffee maker." Voss returned his attention to the room. "I want every officer's weapon, badge, and radio bagged as evidence right now." The local police began to obey. The only sound was plastic and metal hitting the floor. Judge Quill walked to the center of the room. A federal agent immediately brought her a chair. A medic with an FBI patch on his sleeve knelt before her. "Ma'am, you're injured. Your wrists." Amara looked at her wrists. The skin was raw and lightly bleeding where the handcuffs had bitten. "They will heal," she said. She scanned the room, her gaze moving over the kneeling officers. She saw Officer Shaw, the rookie, head bowed, tears running down his face. She saw Sergeant Pike, the booking sergeant, looking like a ghost. Her gaze finally settled on Rhett Callahan. He was on his knees, his face covered in sweat and grime. He refused to look at her. He stared at the floor, at the broken glass, at the wreckage of his life. "Officer Callahan," Judge Quill said. Her voice was not loud, yet it cut through the room, imposing absolute silence. Callahan flinched, but did not look up. "Look at me," she ordered. Slowly, reluctantly, he raised his head. Their eyes met across the chaotic room. "You asked me if I thought my blouse gave me respect," she said in a serene voice without triumph. It was the voice of a judge stating a fact. "You were asking the wrong question. The question you should have asked yourself is whether your badge gave you the right to strip a citizen of her dignity. The answer is no." Then she turned her gaze to Lieutenant Sloan. "And you, Lieutenant, you were given the opportunity to correct this injustice. You were warned. Instead, you chose to participate in a conspiracy to conceal it. You took an oath to the Constitution. Today, you used that oath as a shield to betray the principles it represents. Sloan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked at the faces of his own officers, who now watched him with contempt. He had not merely failed to protect them, he had led them into catastrophe. From the rear of the precinct, a new team of agents emerged. They wore no tactical gear. They wore suits and carried laptop computers. They were the FBI Cybercrimes Unit and the Forensic Evidence Team. "Marshal Voss," the lead agent said, "we're ready to begin data extraction." "Server room is in the back," Marshal Voss answered. "Take whatever you need." Sloan's head snapped up. "It's useless. There was a power surge. The servers crashed. All of today's data is lost. Corrupted," he lied, his voice a desperate squeak. The FBI agent smiled with a thin, humorless expression. "A power surge. What a shame. Fortunately, the U.S. Marshals Service activated a live mirror of your entire network traffic 30 minutes ago. We have everything, Lieutenant. Every keystroke, every deleted file, every frame of video from every camera in this building. You cannot erase the cloud." The finality of that statement settled over the room like a shroud. There was no escape. There was no plausible deniability. Their actions, their words, their conspiracy had been captured, preserved, and were about to be played back for the world. "Take them," Judge Quill said quietly to Marshal Voss. "Take them all into federal custody." The marshals moved forward, standing the Greenfield officers up and replacing the department's handcuffs with the heavy steel of the federal government. As they were led through the shattered doors of their own precinct under the watchful eyes of their conquerors, they were no longer police officers. They were defendants, and their judge was right there watching them leave. The transformation of the 4th Precinct from a bastion of local power into the scene of a federal crime was swift and absolute. The air, once thick with the arrogance of its inhabitants, now crackled with the calm, focused energy of the federal agents dismantling their world. The kneeling officers were processed and loaded into transport vans. Their faces reflected disbelief and fear. Only a handful of key players remained in the main bullpen, which now served as an improvised command center for the federal operation. Lieutenant Sloan and Officer Callahan sat on a hard plastic bench with their hands cuffed behind their backs, guarded by 2 marshals who looked as if they had been carved from granite. From time to time, Sloan muttered something to his attorney, who had arrived looking nervous and overwhelmed. Callahan stared into space with his jaw slack, a man hollowed out by the sudden, violent implosion of his life. Judge Amara Quill sat at a desk, ironically Sergeant Pike's desk, speaking quietly with Deputy Marshal Cale Voss and the lead FBI agent, a sharp, sensible woman named Agent Mira Lang. A laptop was open in front of them, displaying network diagrams and file directories. "We've secured the hidden ledger that Sergeant Kane told us about," Agent Lang reported, pointing to a line on the screen. "It's a password-protected spreadsheet on Sloan's computer, filled with unofficial cash seizures from traffic stops. Looks like they've been running a slush fund for years." "I'm not surprised," Judge Quill murmured as she examined the data. "Corruption is rarely an isolated incident. It is a culture." At that moment, the main door, or what remained of it, was breached again. This time not by force, but by a whirlwind of frantic energy. Mayor Harlan Croft, a heavy-set man in a rumpled suit, burst into the lobby followed by the city's police chief, a stern-faced man named Elias Thorne. "What the hell is going on here?" the mayor bellowed, his eyes wide as he took in the scene of federal occupation. "Who's in charge? I'm the mayor of this city. Chief, arrest these men." Chief Thorne did not move. He was a career cop and understood what he was seeing far better than the politician beside him. He saw the patches, the weapons, the cold professionalism. He knew with a sinking feeling that his authority ended at the shattered threshold. Marshal Voss turned slowly. "Mayor Croft," he said in a flat, indifferent voice, "you are interfering with a federal investigation. I suggest you and the chief wait outside." "I will not," the mayor sputtered, his face reddening. "This is my city, my precinct. You can't come in here like some damn occupying army. This is a simple mistaken arrest, and I will have your badges for this." Then he saw her. He saw the woman in the torn purple blouse sitting at the center of the operation, speaking with the federal commanders as if they were equals. He recognized her, not from the news, but from the annual Law Day breakfasts in the city. His mind short-circuited. "Judge Quill," he stammered. The name was a question, a plea, a horrified realization all at once. Judge Quill stood and walked calmly toward the mayor and the police chief, stopping a few feet from them. The federal agents parted to let her pass like water before the bow of a ship. The revelation was complete. She was no longer a victim, a suspect, or a stranger. She was Judge Amara Quill, and this was now her courtroom. "Mayor Croft, Chief Thorne," she said, in a voice of ice that made both men shudder. "A simple mistaken arrest. That is what Lieutenant Sloan told you on the phone before we seized his communications. There was a report of a suspect matching her description." Chief Thorne began to speak in a tight voice. "Officer Callahan was fishing." Judge Quill interrupted him. "He was profiling. He attacked a citizen because of her race and the quality of her car. When she had the temerity to know her constitutional rights, he assaulted her, tore her clothing, and arrested her unlawfully. His lieutenant conspired with him to fabricate a report and extract a confession. So please do not speak to me of mistakes. This was a series of deliberate criminal acts." The mayor looked from Judge Quill to Callahan and Sloan on the bench, and then back to the table. The political calculations spun in his head. He had to distance himself, and fast. "This is unacceptable," the mayor said, shifting his tone to one of solemn gravity. "The actions of Officer Callahan do not represent the Greenfield Police Department. He will be dealt with severely. I assure you, Judge. He will be dealt with by the United States Department of Justice," Judge Quill corrected him. "As will Lieutenant Sloan, Sergeant Pike, and anyone else who participated in or facilitated this culture of corruption." She narrowed her eyes as she looked directly at Chief Thorne. "Chief, how many excessive force complaints have been filed against Officer Callahan in the last 2 years?" Thorne shifted his stance. "I'd have to review the files." "Don't bother." Agent Lang's voice cut in from the other side of the room. "We already did. 27. All dismissed by Lieutenant Sloan, with his signature of approval at the bottom of every file." Chief Thorne went pale. He was implicated. He was part of the chain. His entire department was under federal investigation. "Chief," Judge Quill declared, "this building is a crime scene. Your servers have been seized. Your files are now the property of the FBI. You and the mayor will give your statements to Agent Lang, and then you will leave." She turned her back on them, a clear dismissal. The balance of power in the city of Greenfield had been irrevocably altered in 2 hours. Back at the desk, she crossed paths with Officer Shaw, the rookie, who was speaking with a federal agent. "Judge," Shaw's voice was weak. He stood when he saw her approach. "I'm sorry. I knew it was wrong. I should have done something." Judge Quill stopped and looked at the young man. She saw genuine remorse in his eyes, not the self-serving panic of the others. "You took an oath, Officer Shaw," she said, her voice softening slightly. "You had a duty to intervene. Today you failed in that duty, and for that you will be held accountable." She paused. "But you did not participate in the lies. You did not use force. And now you are telling the truth. That may make a difference. We will see." She left him with that small scrap of hope and continued back to her station. The city's leadership was shattered. The corrupt officers were in custody, and the long, arduous process of cleaning the wound had only just begun. Discovery was finished. Now came the time for accountability. "Let's test the lieutenant's power surge theory," Agent Lang said, with a grim smile on her lips. She placed a ruggedized federal laptop on the desk and connected a cable to a wall port that the cyber team had activated. "We've redirected the precinct's main monitor through our system. Everyone is about to see what you tried to hide." Lieutenant Sloan, who had been loudly protesting his innocence to his attorney, fell silent. His eyes were locked on the large flat-screen television on the bullpen wall, the one normally used for Amber Alerts and departmental announcements. The screen flickered, and then an image appeared. It was high-definition video, with a date and time stamp from a little more than an hour earlier. The sound was crystal clear. Video 1, Officer Shaw's body camera. The audience, what remained of it, watched the scene from the rookie's perspective. They saw Judge Quill standing calmly beside her shopping cart. They heard her assert her rights politely but firmly. They saw Callahan's growing aggression, his face contorted into a mask of rage. "You think that fancy blouse gives you respect, lady?" Callahan's voice boomed from the speakers, ugly and raw. Then the charge. The camera shook violently as Shaw flinched. They heard the sound of fabric tearing, followed by Judge Quill's sharp intake of breath. In the background, the crowd of shoppers stood with faces painted by shock. The video was devastating. An unprovoked assault on a non-resisting citizen. Callahan, sitting on the bench, closed his eyes. He could not watch. He was watching his career, his freedom, his entire identity being erased by his own actions, replayed in high definition. "Enough," Sloan's attorney said, rising to his feet. "My client does not consent to this public humiliation. Your client is a key witness in a federal criminal investigation," Agent Lang replied without looking at him. "Sit down. The show is just getting started." She pressed a key. "Let's look at the Sallyport camera footage when they arrived at the precinct." Video 2. Sallyport camera. The screen switched to a wide-angle, elevated security camera. It showed the cruiser arriving. It showed Callahan dragging Judge Quill out of the car, her movements stiff with pain. It showed her entering the building with her head held high. The audio captured Callahan's voice. "Maybe a night in the drunk tank will teach you some manners." The casual cruelty of the comment hung in the air. The mayor and the police chief, watching from the side, winced. This was not a mistake. This was malice. Video 3. Booking room. The recording shifted again. Now they saw the scene at the booking counter from a ceiling-mounted camera. They heard Sergeant Pike's jokes. They heard Callahan's lies about a breaking and entering report. They saw Pike deliberately type "no fixed address" into the report. "You are deliberately falsifying an official police record, Sergeant." Judge Quill's voice rang out, serene and precise. Then came Callahan's order. "Strip search." A wave of disgust swept through the room. Even the veteran federal agents wore grim expressions. The video showed Shaw's objection and Callahan's lie about feeling a weapon. It was a clear, unambiguous depiction of a conspiracy to humiliate and intimidate. "And now my favorite," Agent Lang said in a voice that cut like a blade. "This is from the motion-activated camera in the server room, the one they probably forgot about when they decided to destroy the evidence." Video 4. Server room. The image was grainy, infrared black and white. It showed Sloan and Callahan bursting into the small, cluttered room. The audio was clear. "Erase it! Erase everything now!" Sloan's panicked voice shouted. "The computers are frozen!" Callahan yelled back. The video then showed Sloan himself, the lieutenant, the supervisor, diving under a desk and frantically yanking the power cables from the server rack. Sparks flew. The room went dark. The video ended. The television screen went black. Silence seized the bullpen. It was a dense, suffocating silence, heavy with the weight of undeniable truth. The power surge lie had been unmasked. The conspiracy lay exposed for all to see. Judge Quill turned her head and looked at Mayor Croft and Chief Thorne. "This," she said in a voice that resonated with cold fury, "is the culture you have allowed to take root in this city. A culture where an officer believes he is a law unto himself, and his supervisor's first instinct is not to correct, but to conceal. This is not a few bad apples. This is a poisoned orchard." She stood and walked to where Sloan and Callahan sat. They flinched as she approached, like animals bracing for a blow. She looked at Sloan. "You broke the law to protect a man like this," she said, pointing at Callahan. "Was it worth it, Lieutenant? Was his fragile ego worth your career, your pension, and your freedom?" Sloan said nothing. He only stared at the shattered floor. Then she turned to Callahan. "And you wrapped yourself in the authority of the state and used it as a club to beat a woman you decided did not deserve your respect. You are a disgrace to the uniform you wore and a danger to the community you swore to protect." She turned away from them, her back straight, and addressed Marshal Voss. "Marshal, I believe the United States Attorney for this district has been briefed." "He has, Judge," Voss confirmed. "He's drafting the federal charges as we speak. Deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy to obstruct justice, falsification of records in a federal investigation. He's throwing the book at them." "Good," Judge Quill said. "Make sure it's a heavy book. The indelible truth has been revealed. The digital ghosts they tried to manipulate have returned to haunt them, and their judgment is near." The atmosphere in this bullpen was charged with the finality of judgment. The video evidence had been an execution, dismantling the lies of Lieutenant Sloan and Officer Callahan with cold digital precision. They had nowhere left to hide. Judge Amara Quill stood in the center of the room, a figure of serene and righteous authority. She turned her gaze from the broken men on the bench and addressed Police Chief Elias Thorne, who remained near the shattered door, looking like the captain of a sinking ship. "Chief Thorne," she said in a voice that commanded the attention of everyone present, "these men have dishonored their office, their city, and the very concept of law enforcement. They have lost the right to wear the uniform." Thorne swallowed, understanding what was coming. "Your Honor, that is a departmental matter." "It is no longer merely a departmental matter, Chief," she interrupted. "It is a federal matter. But you will do it. The cancer will be excised by your own hands. It is the first step in demonstrating that your department understands the gravity of this betrayal." She looked at Marshal Voss. "Marshal, escort the chief." 2 U.S. Marshals moved to flank Chief Thorne. Their presence was a silent, non-negotiable order. Thorne, pale and stiff, walked across the glass-strewn floor. He stopped in front of his 2 officers. His hands were trembling. He looked first at Lieutenant Sloan, a man he had known for 20 years, a man he had promoted. "Garrett," he whispered, his voice thick with anger and regret. "Give me your badge." Sloan did not move. He looked at the chief with empty eyes. "You're going to let them do this, Elias? After everything?" "You did this to yourself, Garrett," Thorne said, his voice hardening. He reached out and unpinned the lieutenant's badge from his uniform shirt. The small piece of polished metal weighed unbearably in his hand. Then he unbuckled Sloan's gun belt, and it fell to the floor with a dull thud. The sound was obscene in the silent room. Sloan slumped forward, stripped of the symbols of his power, looking like any middle-aged man in a cheap blue shirt. Thorne then approached Rhett Callahan. Callahan was weeping openly. Silent tears ran down his face, and his body shook. He did not resist. He seemed to have shrunk. The aggressive, swaggering bully had been replaced by a terrified, broken child. "Callahan," the chief said in a monotone voice. He did not use his first name. With a series of quick, practiced movements, he removed Callahan's badge, his belt, and his radio. The sound of the Velcro name patch being torn from Callahan's body armor was shockingly loud. There they stood, Sloan and Callahan, in undershirts and uniform pants, disarmed and dishonored, in the middle of their own precinct. They were no longer police officers. They were simply inmates waiting for prison jumpsuits. Judge Quill watched the ritual with a somber expression. There was no triumph in it, only a grim necessity. "This is the consequence of their actions," she said, addressing the two men, but directing her words to everyone who was listening. "Power that is not rooted in integrity inevitably destroys itself." She directed her attention to Sergeant Lyra Kane, who stood against the wall watching the proceedings with a look of painful validation. "Sergeant Kane," Lyra straightened. "Yes, Judge. You kept your oath today when your superiors abandoned theirs," Judge Quill said. "You chose integrity over complicity. That is already clear." Then she looked at the rookie, Officer Shaw, who was being questioned by an FBI agent in the corner. "You as well, Officer Shaw. Your testimony will be crucial. Your willingness to tell the truth will be your redemption." As if on cue, the new United States Attorney for the district, a sharp, energetic man named Silas Reed, entered the precinct flanked by a team from his office. He walked over the debris, surveying the scene with the penetrating gaze of a prosecutor. "Judge Quill," he said, extending his hand. "Silas Reed. We spoke on the phone. My office has received the evidence package from the FBI. The indictments are prepared." He looked at the disgraced officers on the bench. "Are these our defendants?" "They are," Judge Quill confirmed. "Take them," Reed ordered the marshals guarding them. "They will be arraigned in federal court tomorrow morning. No bail." As Sloan and Callahan were lifted to their feet and marched toward the door, the remaining Greenfield officers, who had been detained and were now being processed as witnesses, watched in stunned silence. It was not merely two men who were falling. It was their entire world being overturned. The blue wall of silence had been shattered by a federal battering ram. Judge Quill addressed the remaining local officers. "This precinct is now under federal supervision," she announced in an imposing voice. "All files, all arrest reports, all internal affairs complaints from the last 5 years are being seized and will be reviewed by the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. If you have conducted yourselves with honor, you have nothing to fear. But if you have played the game the way Lieutenant Sloan and Officer Callahan did, we will find you." The threat, spoken with the serene certainty of a judge delivering a sentence, hung heavily in the air. Then she turned to Chief Thorne. "Chief, you are on administrative leave effective immediately. Sergeant Kane will serve as interim commander of this precinct until the Federal Oversight Committee designates an interim chief." Lyra Kane's mouth fell open. Judge, I'm just a desk sergeant." "You were the only one here who behaved like a police officer today, Sergeant," Judge Quill said. "Rank is irrelevant. Character is everything. Now secure your precinct." "Yes, ma'am," Lyra said, straightening with a new light in her tired eyes. The power vacuum had been filled. The old guard had been stripped not only of their badges, but of their very identities. A new order was beginning, born from the ashes of a corrupt and broken system. Sometime later, the gymnasium of Greenfield Central High School was packed. The air, which usually smelled of floor wax and teenage sweat, was charged with tension and anticipation. The bleachers on both sides were overflowing. A standing crowd lined the back walls. It was a town hall meeting unlike any the city had ever seen, broadcast live on every local news channel. The audience was a raw reflection of the city's divisions. On one side, the affluent residents of Oak Creek sat looking uncomfortable on the hard wooden benches. On the other, the working-class families from the downtown and south side of the city watched with a mixture of hope and deep skepticism. They had endured the special brand of justice of the 4th Precinct for years, and their complaints had vanished into the bureaucratic ether. At the front of the gymnasium, a makeshift stage held a long table. Seated at the table were United States Attorney Silas Reed, the new interim police chief Lyra Kane, and several stern-faced Department of Justice officials. The center chair was empty. A side door opened, and a hush fell over the murmuring crowd. Judge Amara Quill stepped onto the stage. She was not the woman in the torn silk blouse from the parking lot. Tonight, she wore the full, severe authority of her office. Her black judicial robe was immaculate, a symbol of the majesty and impartiality of the law. Her hair was pulled back, and her face reflected a serious, determined expression. She walked to the empty chair at the center of the table and sat. With every eye fixed on her, she did not speak at once. She let the silence stretch. Her gaze moved across the divided room, acknowledging the pain, the anger, and the fear on both sides. "Good evening," she said at last, her voice amplified by the microphone, clear and powerful, filling every corner of the vast space. "We are here tonight because a wound was opened in this city. It was not a new wound. It was an old, festering wound that has poisoned this community for far too long. The events of that day simply tore off the bandage so that everyone could see it." United States Attorney Reed stood. "As a result of the investigation led by the FBI and the United States Marshal Service," he announced, "a federal grand jury has returned a 32-count indictment against former Lieutenant Garrett Sloan, former Officer Rhett Callahan, and former Sergeant Donovan Pike. The charges include conspiracy, extortion, theft of public funds, and multiple civil rights violations." A wave of applause and shouts erupted from the downtown section of the gymnasium. The Oak Creek residents clapped politely with expressions of astonishment. "Furthermore," Reed continued, "this afternoon, Mayor Harlan Croft has resigned from office, and former Police Chief Elias Thorne has retired effective immediately. Both are the subjects of an ongoing investigation into municipal corruption." The room exploded. This was more than anyone had expected. It was not merely a failed arrest. It was a complete house cleaning. Judge Quill raised her hand, and the crowd slowly quieted. "Indictments are not a conclusion," she warned. "They are the beginning of a legal process. But tonight is not about a legal process. It is about public trust." She gestured to Interim Chief Kane. Lyra, looking impeccable and professional in her new uniform, stood. Her voice was nervous at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. "For years, the 4th Precinct operated under a culture of fear and intimidation," Kane said, with the conviction of someone who had finally been empowered to tell the truth. "We, and I include myself for not speaking up sooner, failed you. We lost our way. That ends now." She outlined a series of radical reforms, a new independent civilian complaint review board with subpoena power, mandatory ongoing de-escalation and implicit bias training for every officer, a complete overhaul of the Internal Affairs Division, and a zero-tolerance policy for report falsification. "Trust is not given," she concluded, looking at the skeptical faces. "It is earned, and we are prepared to spend the rest of our careers earning yours back. One call, one interaction, one day at a time." The applause for her was sincere, though still a little hesitant. Finally, Judge Quill stood to deliver the closing address. She walked from behind the table to a podium at the front of the stage, closing the distance between herself and the people. "I am a judge," she said. "My job is to be impartial, to weigh the evidence, to interpret the law. But I am also a citizen. I am a black woman. I am a widow. I am your neighbor. For a few hours, I was stripped of my title and my robe, and in those hours, I was treated as less than a citizen. I was treated as a stereotype, a caricature, an object of contempt. She paused, her eyes finding faces in the crowd. The law is a promise. It is a promise that says who you are, how you look, where you live, and how you dress does not determine your rights. It is a promise that the person who wears the badge is your protector, not your predator. In Greenfield, that promise was broken. She raised her voice with power. Tonight we begin to mend it. The men responsible for breaking that promise will face justice in a federal courtroom. The system that allowed them to thrive will be dismantled and rebuilt on a foundation of integrity and accountability. This will be a long and difficult process, but I promise you this: we will not fail. She looked directly into the news cameras at the back of the gymnasium. Let the message from this gymnasium tonight be heard in every precinct, in every city, in every corner of this country. No one is above the law. Not the ordinary citizen, not the officer in the patrol car. The Constitution is not a piece of paper. It is the shield of the people. And in this city, from this eve forward, that shield will stand firm. She stepped away from the podium. A standing ovation erupted, rolling through the entire gymnasium. It was a sound of catharsis, of hope, of a community once fractured by fear and suspicion, beginning to see a path toward reconciliation. The community meeting was over, but the revolution in Greenfield was only beginning. In the sterile mahogany confines of Courtroom 3 of the United States District Court, the atmosphere offered a stark contrast to the raw emotion of the high school gymnasium. The room was silent, respectful, heavy with the weight of federal law. The gallery was packed, a quiet congregation of journalists, law students, and citizens from both sides of Greenfield, who had come to witness the final act of the drama. At the defense table, the transformation of Rhett Callahan and Garrett Sloan was complete. They were no longer police officers. They were defendants, dressed in ill-fitting suits their families had bought for the occasion. Sloan looked defeated, a ghost of his former arrogance, his gaze fixed on the jury box. Callahan was even more diminished. He had lost weight, and his skin was a sickly pale gray. He spent the entire proceeding staring at his hands, which rested trembling on the table in front of him. In the front row of the gallery, directly behind the prosecution, sat Judge Amara Quill. Today she wore no robe, only a simple, elegant gray suit. She was not there as a judge, but as a victim. Her presence was a silent, powerful reminder of the crime that had set these events in motion. She watched the proceedings with a serene, inscrutable expression, her hands folded in her lap. The trial had been swift. The evidence presented by United States Attorney Silas Reed was overwhelming. The body camera footage, the booking room video, the conspiracy in the server room. It was an avalanche of irrefutable proof. The testimony of a dozen citizens who had been victims of Callahan and Sloan in the past painted a devastating picture of a long-standing pattern of abuse. Officer Shaw, the rookie, had testified for the prosecution in a trembling but clear voice, corroborating every detail of Judge Quill's ordeal. Now it was finished. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours. All rise. The bailiff's voice rang out. Judge Orion Hale, a severe, silver-haired jurist, known for his sharp intellect and even sharper sentences, took his seat. Be seated. Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson, a young librarian, stood, clutching the verdict form tightly. We have, Your Honor. A silence filled the courtroom. Callahan squeezed his eyes shut. Sloan seemed to stop breathing. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law as to the defendant Rhett Callahan, how do you find? The foreperson took a deep breath. Guilty, A quiet gasp ran through the room. Callahan flinched as if he had been struck. On the charge of conspiracy to obstruct justice as to the defendant, Rhett Callahan, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of perjury in a federal investigation as to the defendant, Garrett Sloan, how do you find? Guilty. Guilty, Panama. On the charge of conspiracy to obstruct justice as to the defendant, Garrett Sloan, how do you find? Guilty. And so it continued. A drumbeat of accountability. Charge after charge after charge. The word guilty resonated through the silent courtroom, each one a nail in the coffin. After the jury was dismissed, Judge Hale proceeded directly to sentencing. The defense attorneys presented their pleas for mercy, citing their clients' years of service, their families, and their remorse. Judge Hale listened patiently, his face impassive. When they finished, he looked down from the bench at the two defendants. "Service is not a shield," he began in a cold, resonant voice. "Family is not an excuse, and remorse, if it is genuine, has come too late. You were not police officers. You were predators who wore the uniform of public servants as a costume to conceal your crimes." He directed his attention to Callahan. "Mr. Callahan, you committed a violent act not out of fear or in the heat of a dangerous moment, but out of simple bully's pride. You assaulted a woman because she dared to question your authority. You saw her not as a citizen to protect, but as an object to dominate. That is the very antithesis of what a police officer should be." Then he looked at Sloan. "And you, Mr. Sloan, were the supervisor, the leader. Your crime is far worse. You had the power and the duty to stop it, to enforce the law. Instead, you chose to join the conspiracy. You chose to protect the criminal, not the victim. You poisoned your department from head to toe." He paused, looking at the sentencing guidelines before him. "The harm you have caused goes far beyond one woman's torn blouse and bruised wrist. You have damaged the trust between the community and the police, a trust that is the foundation of a civil society. The sentence must reflect the gravity of that betrayal." He looked directly at Callahan. "For your crimes, I sentence you to 96 months, 8 years, in federal prison." Callahan collapsed forward, striking the table with his head in a dull thud, his body shattered by the sobs. 8 years. With no parole in the federal system, he would serve nearly the entire sentence. "Mr. Sloan," the judge continued in an implacable voice, "for your leadership in the conspiracy and your abuse of public trust, I sentence you to 120 months, 10 years. Sloan sat with a vacant stare, unable to process the number. 10 years. A decade of his life gone. "The United States Marshals will take the defendants into custody immediately," Judge Hale declared, and his gavel fell with a crack that sealed their fate. Boom! As the marshals led the two broken, weeping men from the courtroom, Amara Quill stood. She did not look at them. She looked steadily at the American flag standing beside the judge's bench. She had not sought vengeance. She had sought justice. And in the cold, impartial calculation of the law to which she had dedicated her life, justice had finally been done. The gavel had fallen, and its echo would be heard far beyond the walls of this courtroom. A year has the capacity to cleanse a city completely. The seasons changed, washing the asphalt of the Oak Creek Market parking lot with rain and covering it with snow, until the memory of the scattered oranges and the shattered dignity seemed to belong to another life. The cherry trees bloomed along Willow Creek Lane, their fleeting pink beauty a testament to renewal. The city of Greenfield was changing, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. Judge Amara Quill stood in that same parking space where her life had been so violently interrupted. The sun warmed her face. She was once again in civilian clothes, simple and elegant, On her shoulder, a small, expertly placed brooch in the shape of a camellia covered the faint tear in her purple silk blouse. It was a private symbol, a reminder. A new, gleaming white and blue patrol car rolled slowly down the lane. The officer at the wheel was a young woman. She saw Judge Quill beside her car. The officer did not slow out of suspicion. She smiled, a radiant, genuine smile, and nodded slightly in recognition. Judge Quill returned the greeting. The patrol car continued on its way. A guardian, not a predator. The tension that had instinctively formed in Amara's stomach at the sight of a police car had disappeared. She drove from the market, not to her home, but to a small park overlooking the city. A bench beneath a large oak offered a panoramic view. She sat drinking a tea she had purchased. A few minutes later, another car arrived. Lyra Kane, now the permanent police chief, climbed out. Her uniform was impeccable. The gold stars on her collar gleamed. She sat beside Amara. A comfortable silence settled between them. "Last week we graduated our first generation of new recruits under the Quill Doctrine," Lyra said, breaking the silence. "You would have been proud. They spent more time on constitutional law and de-escalation than on the shooting range." "As it should be, Chief," Amara said. "A police officer's mind is their primary weapon. The firearm is their last resort." "The changes are real," Lyra continued, with a note of wonder in her voice. "Citizen complaints are down 60%. Incidents of excessive force have virtually disappeared. The Civilian Review Board is functioning. The consent decree that you and the Department of Justice imposed on the city is working." They sat a moment longer, watching the city pulse with life beneath their feet. "I received a letter," Lyra said quietly, "from the chaplain at the federal prison in Pennsylvania. It was about former Officer Callahan." Amara turned to look at her. "He's teaching a class to other inmates," Lyra said. "He wrote a letter of apology, not to the court or to his attorney, to you." The chaplain said it was 12 pages long. He asked if he should forward it. Amara looked at the horizon. She thought of the man in the cage, the abuser who had built his own prison long before the bars slammed shut. She thought of his rage, his fear, and now perhaps his remorse. "No," she said quietly. "His apology is not for me. It is for himself. I hope he finds peace." Her own peace did not depend on his. It depended on the justice that had been delivered and on the changes that had taken place in her absence. "And Sloan?" "Sloan is Sloan," Lyra said with a small smile. "He's appealing his conviction on a technicality. It won't go anywhere. Some men never learn." Amara finished her tea. She stood and smoothed the front of her jacket. "You know, Lyra," she said, looking at the scar on her hand. A faint silver line from a past battle. "I could have stopped it all before it started that day in the parking lot. The moment he approached me, I could have told him, I am a federal judge. I could have shown him my credentials. I could have intimidated him into backing down." "Why didn't you?" Lyra asked, a question she had asked herself for a year. "You would have saved yourself a world of pain." "Because if my title was the only thing that protected me," Amara said, turning to her friend, her eyes alight with the same fierce intelligence that had defined her life, "then what protection is there for the woman who cleans my courtroom, for the man who delivers my mail, for the teenager who restocks the shelves at the market? If the law only protects the powerful, then it is not law. It is simply a weapon of privilege." And she looked out over the city at the thousands of people living their lives, trusting in the promise of the law. "I had to let him go through the shield," she said. "I had to let him show the world the rot that was hiding beneath the surface. The assault was not the crime, Lyra. It was the evidence. The stain on my blouse was the proof. I had to let him create the evidence that would save everyone else." "You are an extraordinary woman, Amara," Lyra said, shaking her head in awe. "I am a judge," Amara corrected her gently. and the oath is for life." She offered her hand. Lyra took it, a firm clasp between two women who, each in her own way, had rebuilt their city. "Stay vigilant, Chief," Amara said. "Always, Judge." Amara returned to her car. As she drove away, the sun began to set, bathing Greenfield in a warm golden light. She had taken the blow. She had endured the assault. She had walked into the cage to prove that the bars were rotten and the jailers were corrupt. She had paid a price in pain and dignity to purchase a justice that would now protect the defenseless. The most important duty of a judge is not merely to interpret the law, but to enforce it. And on that day, in that parking lot, she had done exactly that. What do you think of the sentences? Were 8 years enough for Officer Callahan? Too many, or just right? And what does it say about a system when the arrest of one of the most powerful people in the country is what finally exposes its flaws? We want to know your opinion. Leave a comment below. Your engagement helps us bring more stories like this to light. If you believe that justice, however delayed, is a cause worth fighting for, give this a like and subscribe to the channel.